right, guys. So we got new inflation numbers yesterday, but we also got a pretty interesting moment from Elizabeth Warren. So this particular segment on inflation has both the good and the bad here, ultimately. Let's start with Elizabeth Warren. So you guys know Senator Warren used to have really good economic politics.
We're talking like 09.
Yeah.
So people know.
I mean, she came into public prominence trashing Hillary Clinton.
And the banks, most importantly.
The banks, trashing Joe Biden for posturing as an ally of women with his, bills against domestic violence, which are important, but meanwhile selling them out financially. I mean, she went toe-to-toe with him on this stuff. And then suddenly when she runs for president, she doesn't say a word about any of that, leans hard into the shallowest, most impotent form of identity politics, things like, throwing Bernie under the bus, pretending he's a sexist, promising to wear a pink Planned Parenthood scarf on Inauguration Day. I know that was your personal favorite.
No, my personal favorite was promising an 11-year-old trans child that they get to pick the Department of Education secretary.
I liked even more than that at the DNC when she had the BLM
oh, yeah, that's right.
in the
little school blocks
behind her. This was a major, I used to love Elizabeth Warren. I was such an Elizabeth Warren stan. And so to watch her debase herself and just crumble into this totally impotent figure that, is not really offering anything, challenging the powerful anymore was very sad for me to see. So this week we had Jerome Powell's confirmation hearings to be reconfirmed as Fed Chair. And Warren is not a fan of Jerome Powell to start with, and I think she's a no vote on that, but he's still going to get confirmed ultimately because Republicans are going to vote for him too. But she really pressed him on some of the reasons that we have such high inflation right now, and forced him to admit that corporations jacking up their prices, using inflation as an excuse to further jack up their prices, was a part of what's going on. Let's take a listen to what she did here.
Let me ask it the other way then, because we're still kind of doing Econ 101 here. If you're a corporation that has eaten up most of the competition and cornered the market, is it easier for you to raise prices on your customers and maximize your profits because you don't have to worry about losing your business? In other words, you've lost the discipline that the market imposes.
In principle, if you don't have competition and you're a monopolist, yes, you can raise your prices.
Okay, and over the past year, we know that prices have risen because of supply chain problems, unexpected shifts in the demand for goods, and even higher labor costs. But if corporations were simply passing along these costs in highly competitive markets, would the company's profit margins have changed much?
So many things affect those that calculation. In principle, you could be right, but
well, it's very much not what we're seeing right now. Today, nearly 2 out of 3 of the biggest publicly traded corporations in the country are reporting fatter profit margins than they reported before the pandemic, which doesn't sound like they're just passing along costs. So let me ask you, does that increase in profit margins combined with greater market concentration in industry after industry suggest to you that some corporations may be passing along increased costs and at the same time charging more on top of that to fatten their profit margins?
that could be right. It could also just be, though, that demand is incredibly strong and that, they're raising prices because they can.
Well, that's the point. They're raising
prices because they can.
Yeah,
which
at the end, we have shown you is absolutely the case.
Yeah.
We looked at that gap in corporate profits, which is up by I think at the high record number in 2021, which again, nobody's denying that there has not been a massive demand shock, as the chairman indicates. That is absolutely the case due to both money, savings, weird wonky stuff within the economy, supplies chain issues, and all of that. But also, as we've seen, the corporations are bragging to their shareholders that because people expect an increase in price, they can increase it even more so than they actually have to. And this is the part too, which also kind of drives me nuts, where people deny the ability for local monopolies. So not necessarily a monopoly nationwide, but in specific areas, obviously have massive ability in order to manipulate price, especially when people don't have all that much competition. And look, we got the final numbers on inflation. Let's look at the key price hikes, where everything is concentrated specifically in these areas which are most subject to the supply shock. Put it up there on the screen. Gas is up 49.6%, or constitutes inflation. Fuel oil, 41%. That's something that really relates to people who heat their homes, especially in rural areas.
And
used
just a
cars.
clarification, this is an annual number.
Annual number.
Right, just so
Sorry
you
about
know,
that.
because
Yeah.
it's a little bit confusing from the tweet. It says inflation hit 7% in December. That's an annualized number.
That's right, yeah. So that's the annualized number, and this is also the annualized increase year over year. Used cars up 37, rental cars up 36, hotels 27, utility gas 24, steak 21, beef 18.6, bacon 18.6, furniture 13.8, tires 12.4, new cars 12. So you guys basically get it. It's gas
11.
and it's food and it's travel. Those are the three things where you've seen a massive increase in price of goods. All three are subject to massive supply shock for various reasons. A lot of it, almost all of it actually has to do with globalization. And I wish that somebody would talk about that. I mean, it drives me nuts that people look at this and you're like, yeah, we have an international gas market. Domestic supply here in the United States is actually subject to international demand rather than domestic demand. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And yet we just allow Exxon and Chevron and all these people to ship out half the gas that we produce here naturally, even though we don't have to. Same whenever it comes to food. I mean, you have a huge increase in the price of fertilizer, droughts in Brazil, droughts in Montana, increase in demand of people staying at home, plus the shipping crisis. Yeah, you have an increase in food. And then, I mean, the used car one, we've talked about endlessly. Semiconductors. I heard stories about Detroit is designing new cars by promising buyers stuff that they'll slot into their car in the future. So they're basically like selling them a 3/4 finished car. This is all plans in Detroit right now because they're freaking out. They don't have cars that they can sell
people. I have a friend who works at the truck assembly plant in Louisville, and he hasn't worked in like 20 days.
Oh my God.
Because they just, it's one thing, it's the chips, they had the, what do they call them, chassis, the frame of the car. They had a shortage of those. I mean, it's just been like one thing after another. And so, it's bad when it turns out that it's good to make some things here and not be totally dependent on, China and the rest of the world for our basic goods to continue living life here. It hasn't worked out that well. And then the other piece of this that Elizabeth Warren very effectively gets Jerome Powell to admit, even though he really didn't want to.
I was surprised by that. I didn't really understand why he was being so reluctant.
Because these are, we have this illusion of the Fed being this like independent, these wise men and women who are largely academics, but they're deeply tied in with Wall Street. I mean, that's their milieu. The Federal Reserve is comprised of a series of regional banks. The whole system was created by bankers effectively. So I think that's why is they're just so tied in with Wall Street that they don't want to admit what the corporations themselves are acknowledging that they're doing. So she gets him to admit, yeah, they're raising prices because they can. Well, that's exactly the point here. They can. They have the excuse of inflation. They have monopoly power. And so they're raking in record profit margins because they're able to use the excuse of inflation to lift prices way more than is actually justified. And so the reason they don't want to acknowledge the globalization issues, just-in-time issues, and the corporate greed issues is because that would require them changing business as usual.
Yeah, that's true.
The easiest thing in the world to do is to say, you all got a little stimulus check, and now you're able to buy a few things. Let's make sure that you're more impoverished so you can't keep doing that. That's the easiest thing in the world for them to do. Then that doesn't require them to change business as usual. So that is part of the story, is that people were able to save. There was a demand shock coming out of the pandemic. People still can't go out and engage in services and those sorts of things. So they're buying more goods. That is part of the story. But why would you want to respond to this multifaceted crisis by making the American people poor, which is what the sort of mainstream conventional wisdom, that's what it would lead you ultimately to do.
Yeah, sadly, that's probably what's going to happen. I just wanted to warn you all, that's almost entirely the most likely thing that's going to happen
100%.
from all this. So,
100%. We're already headed in that direction.
Yeah,
hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.